Hello, everybody, and welcome to Shaman Sister Sessions. My name is Michelle Hawk. I am so happy to be here with my shaman sister, Katherine Bird, and to welcome special guest Dr. Oscar Pérez for a conversation on soul recovery for care providers and grief bearers. Dr. Oscar Pérez is the founder of Tending the Fires, which is a global community and initiatory school for natural-born healers walking the shamanic path. He is the best-selling author of The Flowering War, Toltec Teachings for Healing Ancestral Trauma, a groundbreaking work that has become essential reading for therapists, spiritual seekers, and leaders reclaiming their lineage and life force from generational wounding. Dr. Pérez holds a PhD from Brown University, where his research focused on how intact Earth-based cultures use storytelling, ritual, and collective memory to metabolize trauma and renew the soul of the people. He is a lifelong student and initiated practitioner of shamanism. He weaves ancestral wisdom, transpersonal psychology, and cutting-edge neuroscience into his signature method of soul recovery rooted in the Toltec tradition. He offers retreats, immersive trainings, and he has a special program that we'll be sharing a little bit more with you about. And I will say, Kat and I have been both longtime fans of Oscar. We've followed your work for a long time. So thank you so much for joining us here today. It is a real pleasure to see you and have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. I think we came across your writing. Kat, how did we even? I think you sent me Oscar's Instagram post like 2 years ago or something.
Probably, maybe even more than that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I think you just came across my Instagram at some point. And so I don't actually share a lot of stuff with, probably don't even send, I don't send Michelle that many messages saying, hey, check this out.
No.
But every once in a while you're like, this is legit.
Yeah, like this is a good one, and we've been on your list ever since, and have your book and have been following your work. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit about. We just said, okay, we're talking about soul recovery for care providers and grief bearers. Let's dig into this a little bit. I'd love to hear, how did you come into this work, and how are you? How is it that you're focusing on grief bearers? What is a grief
Mhm.
bearer?
Awesome. That's a
Mm-hmm.
great place to start.
Yeah.
Thank you. Um, so, how did I come into this work? Life, like I was drawn into this when I was very, very young. And so, at about 10 years old was when all of this really started developing for me in my life. Just this interest in my ancestral cultures, right? And my family's predominantly from or I should say, for about the last 300 plus years, we're from northern Mexico and the southwestern United States. And when I was a kid and I started learning about my indigenous heritage, it just overtook everything in me. It became like the main root of my fascination. And simultaneously, there were a lot of things going on growing up that made me wonder why people do the self destructive things that they do, why people perpetuate these patterns of harming themselves and harming those closest to them. And so when I was a kid, I started this apprenticeship with the what I call the healing traditions of intact cultures. Although growing up, all of this in my community and in my family was still very, very taboo. So there were things that people would talk about in terms of different kinds of rituals and ceremonies that were done for healing, but you never talked about this out in the open, right? I mean, we have a cultural legacy, a cultural history of the persecution of these teachings in these ways that is very recent here, or at least where I grew up, right? So, as I mentioned, I'm from the Chihuahuan Desert, from the southern United States and northern Mexico, and and throughout the course of my life, there was this thing that was consistent in me. Ever since I was a very little kid, I would pick up on things that other people didn't want to acknowledge, that other people didn't want to really speak to or speak about, or, um, the elephants in the room, right? Especially the familial ones. I was the one from a really young age that saw it, pointed at it, and said, we need to deal with it. and it was just this inherent thing in me. But as a kid, I learned really quickly that there are things that people do not want seen in themselves, largely because they don't want to see them for themselves, right? And so, socially, in this culture that we live in, we're really accustomed to, um, and by that I mean the culture of modernity, because it expands beyond languages and beyond culture groups. But we're exposed to this idea that there's a certain face that you're supposed to wear to be socially acceptable, and that face has to conform to what everyone else expects of you, right? And you never burden anybody else with the hurt that you're carrying. You never burden anybody else with um, the the accumulation, let's say, of wounding and of rage inside. And so I grew up picking up on and seeing a lot of things that were going on beneath the surface in people, and I learned that it wasn't always wise to try to help or to try to point out those things that were going on in them. Um, and simultaneously, I was the person that when it was convenient, people would come and just unburden themselves on, you know. So even at, 10, 11, 12 years old, I would have people that were in my family, and also not my family, just my community, that were 20 years older than me, just come and just open up and pour out all kinds of stuff that, like, you don't need to be sharing that with the kid, you know. But um I grew and had this identity of being the person that always saw what was going on, like behind the scenes, beneath the surface. um and that also was the one that people would seek out for comfort. But it gets really tricky as you're growing with these kinds of sensitivities, these levels of awareness, and especially growing in a culture, in a society that generally looks to shut that down, right, or shut it out. And so, um, over the years, I became more and more interested in why this happens. Um, I went through a phase in my life that was incredibly self-destructive, because carrying all of that was killing me, and not having people to really share it with and express it with was extremely challenging. And now I largely work with therapists and psychologists, people that work in the mental health field. Back in those days, I had experiences with people that were clinical therapists, people that worked in the field of mental health, and I really quickly saw the limitations and the pitfalls in the conventions of the field. Especially because for me, growing up culturally, there's this entire unseen world that weaves through everything. And that unseen world needs to be a part of healing. It can't be just seen as an aside, and it can't be seen as like just the superstitions of, you know, less enlightened people, let's say, right? And my experiences with people that worked in mental health were over and over again falling short, because things were approached in this very formulaic way. They were approached in a very mechanical way. And they were also approached in a way that completely disregards all of our relationships with the unseen. So modern psychology has emerged out of the idea of the human psyche as being the top of the hierarchy, and everything else is secondary to, if considered at all, right? But from an animistic perspective, from a shamanic and intact perspective, like, we understand that human beings are a thread on a much bigger web. We're not by any means the top of any hierarchy. And what influences us goes way beyond just human to human interaction, that is connected to every aspect of every relationship that we are a part of, that allows for us to be alive. Well, feeling all of these things intuitively and knowing some of these things from my training, and then clashing with the world that just absolutely did not recognize any of that, led to me really rejecting, right, the dominant society, the dominant world, and for a while being really good at being the person that was against all of it, until I realized that that was massively destructive to myself. And all of this, I mean, it culminated with a lot of traumatic experiences, but in my early 20s, I had one experience that was just a massive wake up call. I survived a car accident that I should not have walked away from. And when that happened, something deeper in me clicked, and really made me evaluate the webs of belief that I had, right, and that I lived in. And by that point, I had already been studying the Tolteca teachings for 8 years or so. But there's a big difference between studying things and having the kinds of life shattering experiences that bring it like square in front of your face and make you not be able to look the other way, let's say, or to realize, like one of my teachers, the way that he puts it, he says that the spirit gives us these opportunities, right? Gives us these, in certain cases, like we have an entire concept in the Toltec understanding of this, but gives us these moments where your whole life shatters and falls apart. And at that moment, you have a choice. And the choice is to realign your thoughts, your actions, and the direction of your life with what is true to your spirit, or to deny it and essentially walk down a path that is going to be incredibly destructive to you and to anybody that you care about and anybody near you, right? And so this teacher mind says, yeah, you have a choice, right? You always have a choice. You can choose to do the hard thing and to follow that path that your soul has laid out for you, or you can choose the other, right? You can choose to try to do what's easy and keep going, living the life that you lived up until that point, but your soul will rot.
Exactly.
And and so at that point, I started focusing more on studying this more intentionally, and I started seeing this pattern emerge, where I realized, like, I'm not the only one like this. Like, there's so many people that I've met throughout my life and throughout my work that were born with that inherent sensitivity, that were born with that inherent capacity to feel what others refuse to, and to see what others refuse to see, and that also have that experience of being rejected, like fundamentally rejected and even attacked by the normative society for being the ones that can see that things are not healthy or whole in what the normative society is. And and over the years of studying and learning, both in the Tolteca tradition and other traditions, I came across this notion, this idea of the fact that every generation, in every family, there is one person that carries an unequal amount of the unprocessed trauma, of the unmetabolized grief of the family line, and that person is the one that is born with the capacity to actually learn how to metabolize that grief, learn how to transform all of that has been accumulating, snowballing as it goes down from one generation to the next to the next. And that person would have been trained in an intact culture. That person would have been trained to become the healer of their community or of their village, right? Of their lineage, most certainly. And and so I spent years working with people in like recovering from like the worst depths of addiction and personal and generational trauma, right? And over and over again, I kept seeing this pattern. Right? The people that end up being considered the outcasts, in society, right? And that goes one of two ways in my experience. Generally, it goes one of two ways. Either the person takes on all of that weight to the point where they collapse, and they maintain that complete resistance against society and against norms to a degree that's really destructive for them, and they become, the black sheep, but take it to an extreme. Like, I think the vast majority of modern healers, modern potential healers, are incarcerated or institutionalized, right? And in my experience working with communities of people with severe trauma, I've seen that over and over and over again. Or they go the other direction and they somehow bounce back from it, or they have that kind of tenacity and stubbornness, I guess, and they become these overachievers. And there's usually somewhere there's like some gray area there, right, where they might become incredibly successful in according to these modern standards, but they're doing it um, they're doing it almost as a response to having felt that rejection for their sensitivity and for who they are. And so over the years, I've done a lot of work with public health organizations, with community-based organizations. Again, working with communities on things like reducing domestic violence, reducing the the incidence of self-harm in communities, working with people in recovery and things like that. And over and over again, working alongside like the conventional mental health field and conventional mental health practitioners. I've
Mm-hmm.
seen like where that falls short, but also where so many people that are working in those fields are there precisely because they are this person, they are the grief bearer, and their way of expressing it has been to go through what they're told. It's like, well, yeah, like you need to become a therapist, right? Everyone brings their problems to you all the time, so that's what you need to do. You need to go that
Mm-hmm.
route. um yeah.
Oscar, can I interject something
Uh-huh.
really quickly? Because I love that you really identified sort of these, kind of broad strokes generalizations of the populations of people that you see this in. And I know
Hmm.
I want to add in a group that I see come through often as my students and clients are people who may not be in like overtly exhibiting patterns of addiction, self-harm, etc.,
Hmm.
and may not have gone straight, into the overachiever realm. They're functional in their lives, but they describe the experience almost as if like they're observing their lives, or like this Walking Dead kind of experience where, and maybe some of them are called to the helper healer. They're like, I want to serve in this way, but I just feel so disconnected, often accompanied with like chronic health conditions, autoimmune disorders, etc. So I see that group of people as well. And
Hmm.
for those of us, or for those of members of our audience who are tuning in and listening, I know that Kat and I have people who come through in kind of all of these categories that you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
um i think that's I think that's one of the most painful groups, actually, honestly. Because I think with the people that I'm speaking of specifically, they're really intense, and I'm really intense. So I generally work with really intense people, right? But at the same time, I've most definitely seen that. And and the interesting thing about the group that you're talking about is that inevitably a reckoning comes.
Yes, that's when they find me, or Kat.
Yeah. Yeah, inevitably there's a point where, like I mentioned earlier, shit's falling apart, you know? And they can't keep maintaining the facade of normalcy. They can't keep maintaining the idea of things being okay.
Absolutely.
I was mentioning earlier that we have this concept of this in the Tolteca teachings, and it is It is a concept that's called tepeyolot, which means the heart of the mountain. And it's associated with the deepest inner core within all of us, right? There's a part of you that knows you better than you know yourself. And that part of you holds the memory of everything you've done throughout the course of your life and everything that you've experienced throughout the course of your life. And then some, right? Because we would extend it back and say, well, it stretches back into the memory of the oldest times. But that means it has more of a context of who you are and of why you're here. And this part of you sends out these little rumblings when, like, the very generic misinterpretation of it that's out there is like, oh, it's the Aztec god of earthquakes and caverns and stuff, right? Which is really off the mark, as most of those things tend to be. But the whole aspect of earthquakes is applicable, because the idea is that this part that is deep, deep in you, it sends out these little vibrations, right, that start to emerge in you first through your body. So a kind of unease or a kind of queasiness or a kind of excitement in other situations. And it's telling you, like, this is where you're meant to go. This is not where you're meant to go. But the more you ignore those rumblings, the louder they get. And the louder they get, the more chaotic things seem to be, first within you and then in your life. And the more you continue to ignore them, the more it actually escalates to the point where there's an earth shattering event, and so again, earthquakes, right? But an earth shattering event in your life that makes everything fall apart and makes you really reevaluate where you are. And what's really fascinating about this is that it is speaking to a kind of memory that exists deep in the body and in the bones. So from this perspective, we would even look at certain kinds of physical illness and say, this is that speaking to you. This is that telling you, right, that you're not living the life that you were born to live, that you came here to live. And so that reckoning that I was talking about, that reckoning happens. And again, in a modern culture that has no understanding for that, like, where do people go? I mean, there's the fortunate ones that know to reach out to you all, right?
Eventually.
Eventually, right? The people that come to me, it's always the same thing. It's always the same thing. And they've tried all of the conventional avenues. And they've tried some of the unconventional ones too. You know? Yeah. And
Well,
none of
I
that
find
suffices.
I've been finding, especially in the last few years, I have a lot of clients that are therapists, and I really love working. I really love working with therapists. Like, I love where they're coming from and the transformation of incorporating and bringing these things in and the excitement of it.
Mhm.
Do you feel like you've seen almost an awakening in the more Western studied people where they're like, it's like all of a sudden almost like they're like, oh yeah, this is part of it too. This is
Mhm.
important. Do you feel like there's a almost like shift happening within the Western medical community?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, we can look at some earlier things and see, because the thing is, like, when we're talking about shamanic or animistic understanding, Western psychology has been pulling from it forever, since the beginning. And a lot of people don't actually know, like, the history of these things, so they don't see those connections, right? But like, Carl Jung was the ultimate bridge, let's say,
Yeah.
between the Western idea and shamanic practice or animist practice. So he was and continues to be incredibly influential there.
I was
right?
thinking of that as you were describing the role of the grief bearer in
Mm-hmm.
Jung's description of empaths. He describes it as like not the people who are here to heal these things collectively, but the people who are here to see and point out and bring to light the uncomfortable, wounded parts of the collective unconscious. And they often receive that kind of rejection or like vilification from the collective that isn't ready to recognize that. So I mean that's very almost exactly what you said, but
Mm-hmm.
from Jung instead of from these animistic traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think Jung was just massively influenced, right, by
Yeah, he was a
animistic and
mystic.
alchemical perspectives.
He was visiting indigenous communities. He
Mm-hmm.
was and he was welcomed in. Like they saw that who he was and actually, really spent time with him. And you can and but I found that there's a lot of therapists who like they didn't really get into Jung. Like it didn't, they didn't get into they're like, oh well, yeah, I mean it's there, but didn't really get into like some of the more deeper understandings because I mean he can be complex, especially just to read his books.
Mm-hmm.
Can be a little dry at
Yeah,
times, a little like what are you talking about here?
yeah.
But I think that there is this important bridge, like you're saying, Jung is this
Mm-hmm.
incredible bridge. I think that there is this really important bridge to be able to serve all of these people that are suffering and struggling and having mental health issues and emotional overwhelm and addiction and all of these pieces
Mm-hmm.
to bring in and reestablish the connection to the earth, the connection to ancestors, to bring in practices that activate the body and the
Mm-hmm.
relationship with the body. Of you spoke. You had a term that you said once when we were talking about this ancestral life devouring patterns,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that this is just a brilliant phrase of like really being able to see your life being devoured by what you've inherited and brought through. And I think, especially working with Western people, we have a fear of our ancestors. Like, we're like, oh, well, we think about colonization, we think about extreme religious indoctrination, we think about addiction, violence. And I've met a lot of people who are really, they're rejecting, right? They don't
Mm-hmm.
want to even be present with their ancestral lineage. They're afraid that if they even open that up, it's actually going to make their life worse.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you say about this need to connect and understand what we're receiving, inherited, our ancestors, what's going on with our ancestors? How do we work with them, especially as people who are like, have a actual physical
Mm-hmm.
response to even the concept of it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot there. Um, I think first and foremost, the scope of it needs to be understood, right? Because from a modern perspective, when people think of ancestors, they think very recent. They think, oh, my maybe grandparents, great grandparents, maybe pushing it back like another generation or two, but that's about as far back as it goes, right? And there's so many, so the world that we live in is shaped by stories, and the people that control the world control the stories. And if the stories that they're feeding you about the people that you came from are horrific and that's all you hear, then yeah, you're not going to want to connect to it, right? You're not going to want to understand, well, I come from human beings. And every single human being has all sides to them, right? And at different points in time, people think that they're doing the right thing for their family and their loved ones. And then nowadays, this timeline gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So the things that you might have thought that you were doing with the best intentions 10 years ago, tomorrow can be deemed the most toxic thing in the world.
Yeah.
Right? Depends on who's controlling the story. And this is a really interesting topic because every single one of us is a point of convergence on a web of relationships. And the threads on that web go as far back as time in each direction, right? So all of us have had ancestors that have done incredibly beautiful, life affirming things. And all of us have had ancestors that have done atrocious, violent things. All of us. Nobody ever is exempt from that. But the fact that we're here means that we are all connected to every single being all the way back to the beginning. So when you're talking about ancestors, who are you choosing? Are you choosing the ones that everyone tells you you should vilify and be angry towards and afraid of? Or are you choosing to actually learn about the humanity of the people that you come from and acknowledge that there is beauty everywhere in all of those threads? You know, as someone that has a significant part of my lineage is indigenous here from the Southwest, and a significant part of my lineage is indigenous from the Iberian Peninsula. And I was taught growing up, oh, you're Mexican, right? And since you're Mexican, like, this is what you think about those European colonizers, you know? And I realized through direct experience that there are intact earth-based people in Spain and in Portugal to this day that survived the same kinds of atrocities that happened here and everywhere else, and that still hold to their intact ways and connection to the land. So I think it's really important for people to realize that the generalizations that we're fed about who we come from are fictions that are made to benefit somebody. Okay? They're not the truth of who your people were or who your people are. They're just one aspect, right? And that aspect tends to be sensationalized one way or the other. Either they were like, the epitome of humanity and like the best possible people, or they were the scum of the earth. Nothing is ever that cut and dry.
Right. Or either the victim or the conqueror, the victor, the
The
abuser.
victimizer. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of romanticization of that, and again, I've noticed this in some friend community leader teachers where, and I always think of one particular person in general because this person has a very mixed cultural heritage, and they only ever mention the ones that are kind of in
Cool.
vogue. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, but all these other and I've heard them mention these other ancestral roots as well. I'm like, there's nothing wrong with those. It's just the ones that are a little more like, I don't know, just and you know what I mean when I say that, like the ones that are easier to claim in the current cultural context without being vilified or pointed a finger at in the colonizer
Or
reality. But
what is spiritual, right? Your
right.
the spiritual ancestors that you're allowed to claim.
Right,
Right.
exactly. But I feel like there's also this recency bias in this. So Oscar, I love that you mentioned like, well, if you go back far enough, like all of our
Mm-hmm.
ancestors are indigenous to somewhere. And
Mm-hmm.
this is part of what I teach my students and my clients is like animism is our collective birthright. Like this is the
Absolutely.
original way of relating to earth, relating to our non-human relations,
Mm-hmm.
relating to our bodies, to nature. Like there is not a single culture in the history of humanity that does not have animistic origins. But depending on how far back you go, and depending on the migrations of ancient peoples across the land and how they came into contact with each other, and conflict over resources, then the recency of those cultures being either assimilated or conquered or brought under a different cultural or religious or spiritual dominion, then that gets stamped out at different points in history. But I remember, as far as coming into relationship with not only my shamanic lineage, but also my bio lineage, was the two were actually very related for me, where the main shamanic lineage that I hold comes from what is now Hungary. And my blood lineage is primarily like mixed European ancestry. But in researching the movements of ancient peoples, looking at, okay, when Europe was covered in ice, or Eurasian continent was covered in ice, as the ice melted, the first thing to follow the ice was the reindeer, and then the people followed the reindeer, and this group of people went north and became what is now the Sami people, and this group of people went south and became what are my ancestors. And looking at and then of course continued to move from there and continued to go west to like become the Druids, and then the Druids were all over the place. So it's really this it's this dance and movement, and of course Kat and I have talked previously in other episodes about good medicine always travels, and it always has. Wisdom always travels, it always has. And all of these wisdom traditions that that we see now in the world have learned from each other. Mystics hiked over the Himalayas to meet with Taoist mystics and yogic mystics, and they were in conversation and teaching with each other. So these like the deep relation of these wisdom traditions is so inherently like rooted in our the plurality of our collective lineage. So there's this interesting way to relate to, yes, of course, understanding and ancestral reclamation and honoring and respect. And like our Gaian birthright is animistic practice, bottom line.
Absolutely. I think it's woven into what it means to be human. And I think that, again, it's just the scope, right? It's the scope of time that we're given, which, interestingly enough, is getting shorter and shorter and shorter every single day, right? I think now you have less than, I don't know, 2 seconds, 3 seconds to try and catch someone's attention, right? Because our understanding of time is constantly getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Then what that does is it makes us blind to the larger cycles that happen in nature and that happen in the patterns of behavior of human beings, right? The shorter your memory is, first of all, the easier you are to control. And second, the easier it is for you to get blindsided by things that that people at other times would have been able to see coming. We briefly talked about this idea of the calendars. So first of all, to like situate the Toltecs. So when people talk about Toltec nowadays, from a historical perspective, it's believed to be a small cultural group that is centered around what's now Tula in the state of Hidalgo in Mexico. But this is a gross misunderstanding of what Tolteca is. In the oral traditions and in their own written language, which is a picture language, there's this explanation that essentially a Tolteca is a person that is guided by knowledge, by the search for knowledge and by the embodiment of that knowledge in a way that beautifies life. So in like really, really generic definitions, people have said, well, Toltec means artist of life. But we have to understand artistry in a completely different way. It's not an artist as in someone that produces a piece of art. It's somebody that through their actions inspires what is life affirming in everything around them. Right? So everything that a person does is breathing life into life. And again, from an animist perspective, so it's bigger than just human to human contact, right? But so these Tolteca were people that are obsessed with the different cycles that happen in nature, cycles in the stars, cycles that happen with the earth, and cycles that happen in behavior within human beings. Seeing all of those things as wheels within wheels, right? And and so in that, they developed a system for understanding relationship that now is very generically just called a calendar, but it is not. It's the closest thing that we could relate it to now, and how modern people think of things is more like a quantum computer, right? A quantum understanding of inner and outer relationships and how they shape everything, right? Well, these Tolteca, a big part of their life was traveling, and they would set off and go on these migrations that were hundreds of years. So the ones that were leaving understood they're not going to reach where they think they're going in their lifetime, right? And they traveled all over what we now think of as the Americas, both gathering knowledge, sharing science, you know. And so nowadays people will talk about these calendars. They'll say, oh, the Mayan calendar, right? The Aztec calendar, the Cherokee calendar. Excuse me. All of these are actually interconnected. All of these have a shared root in this animist way of observing all of the different relationships in the world. And one of the things that that provides is the ability to witness cycles in humans, right? Cycles and what happens in like the way of thinking of human beings and the way of behaving of human beings as well. And it really invites us to stretch our mind into this idea of deep time. When we can perceive things through deep time, we start to see, okay, like the last 400 years, 500 years, they're a repetition of other cycles that have happened at other points in time, right? The people that we come from were affected by those cycles in various different ways, but they're not defined by those cycles, right? Because we come from other people that existed before those cycles happened, right? And we start to be able to understand patterns of, if we want to call it this way, patterns of wounding and healing that are much larger than just the individual. And that's when we start to really look at, well, what does ancestral healing mean, right? What does ancestral wounding mean? And what does it mean in that like big scope or big span of things? Like really often nowadays, people will talk about this idea of the 7 generations, right? They kind of picked it and pulled it out of different indigenous or native traditions here and there, and people will talk about that, right? But rarely will people actually think of the scope of that. In this Tolteca way of seeing things, we see things in cycles of 13 and 20. And if you look at, or you think of 13 as steps heading up to a top of a platform like a step pyramid, and you go, you know, one at a time, the top is the 7th, and then you go from 7 down to 13 over here. So when we're talking about the 7th generation, we're actually talking about the person that is like right smack in the middle of the 6 that came before and the 6 that come after. And so there isn't just this talk of like, you have to think about what you do for the next 7 generations or how that's going to impact the next 7 generations. You actually realize you are the product of the 6 generations before you. right? You carry the potentials, let's say, of the 6 generations before you, right? Your healing echoes back those 6 generations and then echoes forward the others, right? And we start to like expand that and open it up. So to the people that say like, I don't want to deal with my ancestors, well, you're also dismissing your own children. I don't want to work to heal any of this ancestral stuff. Well, that's setting the tone for the lives of your grandchildren and your great grandchildren, right? If you don't do the work, then whatever got passed on to you gets compounded through you and then gets passed on to them, you know? So the scope is bigger, and our context within the scope, I think, also really influences what our choice can be, to not say should be, right? In terms of how we approach these different things.
Yeah. I feel like there's so much of alleviating the either feeling of loneliness or rejection that we're talking about, of people who maybe are the grief bearers of their family lineage or of their generation, and then the rejection that they experience for living and feeling and seeing and really bringing to light the traumas and the wounding and the distortions within their lineage and the collective. And I feel like whenever whenever in my personal experience, having done this and then also supported my clients in this, in working with the ancestors and having this different perspective around that, it is such a soothing balm to that feeling of isolation and that feeling of like rejection from the family. Even if the immediate bio family is still in a space of rejection, there's like this different perspective that enables, and making offerings to the ancestors and receiving mediumship communications from the ancestors can just be such a peaceful reconciliation of that internally. So it's really beautiful and deep, and can be so like excruciatingly lovely and comforting, all within that as
Yeah.
If you can get to the uncomfortable
Oh
part,
yeah.
you know,
Yep.
I find it really helpful for people. I know for myself and my own journey of ancestral reconciliation, of like learning who my ancestors were, being with the things that feel uncomfortable to me, especially as a Western person, and the things that are really beautiful. And I found it really helpful to like have a practice of prayer for my ancestors. Like, even if you don't feel like you don't know how to maybe talk to them yet, but for even the ones that maybe they didn't live the best life, maybe they didn't make the best choices, but to be in that offering towards them of, in a prayerful way, that that they have peace, that they have healing for themselves, that you consider, like, that we even consider our ancestors worthy of the healing that then is passed on to us. I think can be a important little shift to do when you're first thinking about like, how do I even get started with this?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think both things. I think talking about grief bearers, actually, no, I can expand. Let's not just say grief bearers. Everybody in the modern world, right? What's killing us is isolation, is the illusion of it, right? The illusion of carrying everything alone. And I think that when we start to understand things from this animist perspective, right, we start to understand, no, like, you've never been alone, right? The great illusion is that you've been alone. And approaching these kinds of relationships with ancestors from that perspective, one of the things that I've found is useful is to let people know, like, that loneliness that you feel, they feel it too, because they miss you. You may not be aware of it, but that like great sense of emptiness is shared because you live as if they never were, and they're around you all the time, like feeling your absence.
Oscar, one phrase that I see in your emails that you've used that I just love is starving your ancestors, like in the absence of that communication and offering. I remember the first time I read that and what you wrote, I was like, that is it. That's the term that I've been looking for. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think people don't understand that they're always talking to you. Like they're always like putting out these little threads just waiting for you to listen and hear them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's on both sides though, right? Because we have ancestors that are healthy and whole and intact, and we have the ones that are not. And I think that there is that, like, we're the most well, unless if people have children, but we're the most recent iteration of them. So we carry their potentials for beauty, potentials for artistry, potentials for love, potential for all of these things. We carry those in us. And even if we're not aware of it, we're seeing the face of our ancestors all the time through the things that move through us. And like I said, that can go both ways. So if we don't connect to those way back ancestors, for many of us, the most recent ones are very wounded. And you're right, they're constantly whispering in our ears. They're constantly speaking to us. And this is one of the things that's like so sinister about a materialism based culture, is that if you're not taught that something exists to begin with, how are you ever going to know to listen for it? How are you ever going to know to turn your awareness towards it? Especially if every time you do experience something like that, people want to like shut you down or tell you that you're crazy or whatever it may be, right? But cultivating this awareness helps us become more discerning too, to which ones we listen to and which ones we allow to guide our lives and our decisions.
Yeah. And how we break those patterns that are alive in us that we may be living even unknowingly. Can I tell a story real quick? I don't know if I've ever told this story on our podcast of when I was attacked by an owl. Kat, do you remember me telling this story ever on the podcast?
I don't know if you told it on here.
Okay, I've written about it a few times. Okay, so this is related to what we're talking about. So I'll make the background kind of short. So in 2017, I had just moved to a new place. It was right around the fall equinox. And after a day of unpacking boxes, I love walking, and I'll just go out and walk everywhere, particularly when I move to a new place. That's how I explore and orient myself. So this house was near a patch of forest in a creek. And so it was in the evening, I was out walking, and I walked through this patch of forest. I came out the other side, and something smacked me in the back of the head, like really hard. And I whipped around. What was that? Grabbing the back of my head, and I saw an owl flying back to land on a tree and was staring at me. And I've always loved owls. And I know in some cultures they're regarded as, either like bad omens or like harbingers of bad news. And I've never really understood that because I love owls, but this one was a barred owl. And if you look at them, their eyes look completely black. And in that moment, I had this, I get why some cultures are really afraid of owls, like these black eyes just staring at me. And I was standing there, like holding the back of my head where these welts were coming up, like as I was holding my head. And it flew at me again. And I like raised my arms up. I went like this and I yelled, and it veered off. And so I was shaking and I walked around thinking like, I don't know how to get home except to walk back through that little zone. Okay. I psyched myself up. I pulled my hood over my head. I like pulled my sleeves over my hands in case I needed to like, swat away an owl. And I walked back through. It didn't come at me again. And uh and I had this, yeah, again, these massive bumps right on the back of my third eye. So I looked it up. Apparently, this is a thing. Barred owls are known to be like particularly aggressive toward people if you come near their nests around like dawn and dusk in spring and in fall. So I went back the next day and I saw a snag with a hole in it. I was like, oh, that's its home. Got it. That's why. About a week later, I was getting the call to put myself on the table and do some really deep healing work. I didn't really know exactly what for, but I was getting tapped of like, hey, you need to do this. So I set up my table and I put myself on the table and I entered into my trance state. And I saw rushing up toward me those same black eyes. I saw the owl eyes just right into my face. And I heard the words clear as night. It is safe to see in the dark. And then what came crashing through was this. I saw very clearly this ancestral pattern in my lineage that I had been living out in my life that I had seen before, but never actually like put the pieces together as, oh, this is an ancestral, if you want to call it a curse or a shadow pattern or some kind of distortion. And I ended up sobbing on the floor of my healing room for hours as Owl helped me see so clearly this pattern that was alive in my life and in my like generations back. All of the people in my family, I saw it so clearly. And I realized, oh, Owl came to like activate the back body of my third eye to see in my lineage, to see in the darkness, to see this so clearly. And it, primed to open me up to offer this work. And since then, Owl always shows up very, very strongly. I live now in the forest. There's great horned owls around all the time. I see them, like I hear them almost every day. I see them at least once a week. It's so wonderful to have owls so present in my life, and I will remember that so clearly forever. And they show up in my healing work. But anyway, in terms of our having that work and that relationship with our ancestors, it is, it can show up in ways like that where you get smacked in the head with it. Usually there's some sort of messenger that shows up to support us when we're ready for that. And that's one of my incredibly impactful experiences of ancestral healing.
That's an awesome story. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. Yeah. Now there's owls all over my healing room. I've got an owl painting up here, and owl feathers over there, and an owl drum over there.
It wasn't long after that I was like, oh, Michelle, we took a online owl painting course together and we painted owls together.
It was a couple of years later, but yeah, it was not long after that. And that's the owl painting that I have right up here in my healing room. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. That's really cool. Yeah, I love owls. I do. I love
Of course
them.
You do.
I love them. And when I was starting college, I first went to school to be a wildlife biologist, and I changed along the way. But one of the first things that I was hired to do, because I worked as a technician, like while I was taking classes, and one of the first things I was hired to do was to study burrowing owls. And it was always a hilarious thing whenever I'd be visiting family and there'd be like extended family there. And my aunts would be like, mijo, ¿qué estás haciendo? Like, what are you doing? I'd be like, oh, I'm studying owls. And they'd be like, like why?
Yeah. But leave it alone. Yeah.
Totally.
Love it.
Totally. But so there's a story that I heard once that I think is really useful for that. So, in animist cultures, everyone's people. So the mouse is people, the rabbit is people, the trees, the plants are people. There's a specific thing that certain owls do when they hunt, which is that they will call when they see a mouse or a rabbit running along the forest floor. And they call out because when they call out, the prey animal will freeze, which gives the owl enough time to swoop down and pick it up. So in many cultures, they say whenever you hear an owl call, a person is going to die. Okay. But for animist traditions, right, like people learn all these things about animals, about our more than human relatives through direct relationship and observation. And so if we go way, way back, right, and someone said, whenever you hear an owl call, someone's going to die. Well, it's because someone might be the mouse,
Yeah.
or might be the rabbit, or might be another bird, but they're still people. And so I think what happened over time is the more disconnected people became from their intact relationships with the land, the less people meant more than human people. The more it became other humans, right? But the story stayed the same.
Mm.
When you hear an owl call, someone is going to die.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that. I love that. And reorienting either the stories or the narratives that we have to the original context. Yeah, I love it. Side note, I don't know if I shared this with you. My background is also in biology in animal
That's
behavior.
awesome.
And my undergrad research is in hummingbird foraging behavior. So
Oh, that's so cool.
yeah, so science and animism for me, it was, and by that point as a teenager, I was already studying and practicing shamanism. And then I went to university and I was like, well, of course, all the hummingbirds have messages and all the plants are talking to each other, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. I think it's funny because like that's also this false dichotomy, this idea of like science and spirituality, they're like at odds and whatever. Um, that's that's a spell, is what it is. Just like the spell of separation, right? Or the illusion of isolation. They're collective spells that are cast on the minds of the people that create more pain and more suffering than
Yeah.
anything else. I think to truly live in an animistic way, you have to have a scientific mind. You have to approach things, right, from the perspective of seeking direct experience, honoring direct experience, because it's the only way that you can actually live like this and be rooted, you know, be tangibly living in relationship, right? So it's not dogmatic. It's not dogmatic other than be a good person, right? Don't harm people. Um, I suppose, I mean, because even that, like if we look into um, older shamanic traditions, conflict was always a huge part of them, always. And that's another thing too, that I think is another spell that's like cast on modern people, is this idea that someone that has spiritual knowledge immediately is a benevolent person. And that is
Right.
so not true.
Yeah, we've illuminated this a lot on our on here because people are
Mhm.
often misconstrue that someone has energetic spiritual power, knowledge, wisdom, training, whatever, that they're automatically ethical.
Mhm.
And that often gets people in a lot of trouble.
Mhm.
False sense of security. Yeah, we have a lot of episodes about different topics. So if you're tuning in and you're wondering, gosh, like I need to learn more about that, go look back through the archives. We talk about that a lot. Oscar, I
Mhm.
want to bring it back around to I want to like triple underline what you just said of like to have this animistic orientation, you need a scientific mind or a scientific perspective. I love it. You're speaking my language. For me, they're so connected. But let's bring it back to the care providers, the mental health workers, and I also want to bring in. I have a lot of clients who work in Western medicine in some capacity. They're nurses,
Mhm.
they're physicians assistants, hospice workers, like they're in some care of medical providers.
Mhm.
And I got to tell you, there's more and more like nurses and practitioners and surgical assistants
Mhm.
going through shamanic awakenings, and I'm here for it. It's great.
That's
You know,
awesome.
but having this, you know, they're like they'll tell me these stories of like speaking with the, you know, they're calling the angel of death who's standing there in the OR, and the angel of death is
Hmm.
saying that person's going to live, and they're like, "Are you watching what's happening?" Like, no, they're not, and then the person wakes up, and
Yeah.
um, I love it. It's so great. You know, so with this, as I'd love to hear, can you tell us a little bit more about your program that you're offering and how you're supporting care
Hmm.
providers in this?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few years back, I started putting together more and more work to work specifically with people that are in either mental health or allopathic health. Like I have a few students and clients also that are MDs and that are nurses, and I agree. I see more and more people that are in these healing fields that are being drawn towards shamanic or animistic teachings, and um, and so over time, people that I worked with that were in the mental health field, I kept seeing them wrestling with the same thing over and over again, right? This massive feeling of being overburdened emotionally, energetically, and and um, and not finding the support that they needed to be able to recover and restore from that. And I mean, you all know, like, there's nothing that is taught about energetic hygiene in modern approaches to any kind of health, right? Well, I can't say any kind, but like allopathic and conventional mental health. And I kept seeing again that my students and clients were grief bearers. They were that person in their family. So about a year ago, I stepped away from almost everything, at least publicly. Like I was looking on my Instagram account the other day, and I haven't published anything in almost exactly a calendar year. But I pulled away from all of that to really focus on how do I put something together to help the ones that are doing this healing work in that capacity. And I took what had been about a year long apprenticeship and condensed all of it down into a 3 month program. And it's a program that's called the Soul Recovery System. And the program is all oriented towards um, what I call inherited fragmentation, right? Which is the soul loss that happens in the generations prior to us that is then passed on to everyone in the following generations, but more of it, like an unequal amount, falls on the shoulders of the grief bearer. And so I put together this program to specifically work with people that are in the mental health field that have that history of being the sensitive one, the perceptive one, and also the one that has carried the emotional weight, the bulk of the emotional weight of their family and their lineage, and that found their way into working in mental health. So that's that program is the entire focus of the work that I'm doing with tending the fires right now with TTF. And
Tending the Fires is your membership community, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Okay.
our
We'll have the
community.
links for everything in the show notes as well. So if you're listening in and you want to get in touch with Oscar, then we'll have everything in there that you can reach out to him.
Yeah, thank you. Um, but so the idea is to help as many people as possible be able to develop this much bigger understanding of who they are, of why they carry what they carry, and of how to process all of those things that they carry too, so that they can move forward with their work in the world. And in some cases, that means that they stay in the field that they're in. And in others, it means that they spread their wings, so to speak, and they see that their capacity for helping others heal is bigger than the limitations that they're facing in their field. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Oscar. It's really an honor to have you join us and share your wisdom. And I just love Your book, also I have a copy of your book here, The Flowering War, which is incredible. Everybody should buy this book. It really gives you a really solid journey of like going through this, kind of hearing the call and those rumblings that you're talking about, and then what do you even do with that, and giving people some very just solid practices and advice, and like, hey, this is normal that you're having this experience, and here's what you do with it. And just, talking about, really, one of the phrases, I think you say something in there about just like bring your story to the earth, and just how much you have to reconnect to your body. Like, you start with the body, and reconnecting with the body and the earth, and developing those relationships as like the foundations of moving yourself through what a lot of times, going through an awakening, going through healing, it can be a lot. It can be really painful. It can be confusing. It can be challenging on levels that you never even considered that you would have that challenge. And so it's a really beautiful book for anybody who's on this path and looking for, okay, how do I move through these rumblings that are coming up?
Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. We get a lot of people tuning in here for whom that would be very relevant. So go buy the book. Yeah. And you can find more about Dr. Oscar's work through his website, droscarcperez.com. We'll include, like I said, everything in the show notes. So if you're called to touch base with him, get on his email list. He writes the most beautiful newsletters. And that's how we got connected originally. I had a little bit of like, oh gosh, is he even going to respond? Like, this wonderful practitioner who has this beautiful body of work. But I replied to one of your emails, and thank goodness here you are. This was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on our show. I am certain that our audience will get a lot out of this conversation. And I am so, so grateful that we're here to help support you in your work, your beautiful work. And for those of you who are called, if anything in this is resonating with you, please reach out to us. You can share this episode with anyone you think needs to hear this message. You can find more about my work at michellehawk.com or Kat's work at katherinebird.com. And thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much.